Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Malachi's Message, Toxic Mold Sucks podcast. I'm Elizabeth Kripe, co-founder and executive director. Co-hosting today is Emily Rochelle. She is our co-founder and board chair. Today, we have an amazing privilege. We get to talk to Dr. Peter Osborne. Dr. Peter Osborne is a doctor of chiropractic, doctor of pastoral science, and an expert in functional nutrition, and is board certified with the American Clinical Board of Nutrition. You've probably heard his name attached to things like the Gluten Free Society and No Grain, No Pain. Dr. Peter Osborne, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to talk with us.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Dr. Osborne, we brought you on because, obviously we love everything that you do and all the knowledge you're giving out to people that are going through mold, but you actually also went through mold too. And you have your own mold story, which was more recent. But before that, you were treating people for mold, and then you kind of went into mold. Can you tell people about your story and what you're doing?
Yeah. So, my practice, I've been practicing for 21 years. And, generally people with chronic inflammatory neuromusculoskeletal autoimmune disease come to see me when the mainstream system has utterly failed them and not achieved any great result. And so I'm never the first guy. I'm always like the last guy in a line of probably 10 plus doctors. So it's part of my job, and the way I see it is I have to be an investigator. I have to, put on my Sherlock Holmes hat and really go deep with folks. And so we've been dealing with mold for years, as far as treating patients and helping them figure out that mold is even playing a role in as a trigger for their conditions. And so to me, one of the hardest things in the world to do is to tell somebody their house is poisoning them. House is the heart of our life, right? It's where we join socially. It's where we convene and gather with the people we love the most. It's a safe haven. It's supposed to be the one place we can go in the world and not feel isolated, not feel pressured, not feel anything other than just comfort. And to sit down with somebody and say your house is killing you, it's a tough conversation for several reasons. I mean, you've got the psychology, which we can go into if you care to. I mean, most people I see are women, in their mid 40s and older, who stay home, and they're in mold all the time, and their husbands, because they stay home, their husbands usually are really hard workers, right? Really great income earners, and they're out there doing what they do best. And so they're not home as much. These guys are putting in, 12 plus hours a day, and, they're being exposed to mold, but just far less, right? And they have a reprieve or a break. But these women who are in it all day, every day, don't have a reprieve. And so a lot of times that conversation is just trying to convince a husband that the house is killing his wife. So there's that, right? You're trying to convince somebody that their wife is not actually crazy. Not that, lots of husbands think their wives are crazy, but it gets to that point when somebody's been chronically ill for 15 or 20 years and been to every medical expert, and all the medical experts have written them off as psychiatric patients, right? Here's some Prozac, here's some, here's an SSRI, go home, it's in your head, you're under too much stress, take it easy. And that, that's obviously not the case. So you're having this conversation with a family, trying to tell them that their house is killing them. And it's just tough. And not that I'm not up for a challenge. I certainly am. But I was praying one day. I was just praying to God, and I said, God, please, no more mold. Just quit sending me chronic mold. It was really not very much longer after that. I mean, I've been dealing with it for well over 10 years. I've been in practice 21 years, but really didn't start diving into mold until it was, about 10, 11 years ago. It was shortly after that prayer that my wife was getting sick. My dog died. My son was having fevers and rashes of unknown origin. Here I am. I'm supposed to be the guy that knows how to figure this stuff out. And it took me a long time really to figure it out. I mean, we'd had Our house was 2.5 years old. It was, it was a relatively new house, new construction, very professional builder. But anyway, I think my answer was, he's not going to quit sending me mold. He actually put me in mold because he wanted to make me better at it. So we went through it. It was rough. Our house was, he said it was a dream house. Worked my whole life to get to a point, where I could be on a farm. My wife grew up on a farm, and so we lived in the city to sacrifice until we could afford to move out and get land and build a house. So, to go through that, and then to be told that your house was killing you, right? I mean, here I'd been telling people that for a long time, but to experience it yourself, it's a different ball game, no doubt about it. And I can remember getting our reports back. I'd said, this just feels like mold. And we did some mycotoxin testing, and here we come back. Some of the highest levels I've seen clinically in anyone were in my wife. And of course, she can't get out of bed, and she's a CrossFitter, right? She's phenomenal physical shape. Wasn't able to get out of bed, couldn't focus, couldn't think, brain fog. I was completing most of her sentences. It was super frustrating to try to communicate with her because she couldn't think. And to see your wife go from, highly functional individual to just somebody who can't function, it's hard to watch. We didn't know it at the time, right, why our dog died, but she had major intestinal problems, and she started barfing everything up. And I feed my dog the way I feed myself, which is raw food, solid raw food, organic. She was in phenomenal shape before the mold, and the mold, she was, she's an 8-pound dog, so it took her first. I had another dog, German Shepherd, 95 pounds, and he was starting to become emaciated in the home. So we almost lost him. And he's still actually to date, he's still kind of trying to recover. He hasn't fully recovered from the internal mold infections, the internal yeast infections, because his immune system was so hammered by the mold, environmental mold, that he started growing fungus in his fur and fungus in his ears. I mean, the fungus so bad that he had wet in his ears. You could hear the sloshing of the liquid, from his immune system producing excessive sebum to try to help him combat that. And so, we went through that. And again, I go back to, I asked God not to send them to me, and he sent it to me directly. And it just made me more aware of so many more things coming out of it, more aware personally about how it can affect you. Not that I don't have, I pride myself on bedside manner. I mean, I really try to be as empathetic as a person can be who's not going through a major illness, who's trying to help people who are going through major illnesses. But mold gave me just an entirely different perspective on the complexity and the lack of objectivity that people have to go through in order to find answers. Because, there's so much esoteric subjectivity in this arena. You've got so many problems from, crappy mold inspectors who do an air test and call that a mold inspection, as you guys know. That's like a doctor, performing a blood count test and telling a person they're healthy as a horse without, doing anything else. You've got bad mold inspectors, you've got lack of training, you've got corruption in the construction industry, you've got gaslighting of doctors who don't understand toxic mold or mycotoxins or mycotoxin-induced illness. And so they gaslight their patients into making them think they're crazy. You've got people that are actually in suspended belief about whether or not they're in mold. They can't actually believe it a lot of times that their house is killing them. It's a hard thing to wrap your mind around, especially if you are in a home where there's no visible mold growth. It's one thing if you look up at the ceiling and there's black mold and you can visualize it, but it's a very different thing altogether when there is no visualization at all. And in my case, we had 250,000 spore counts in our wall cavity. And the air test showed normal, right? The air test of the main rooms showed normal, but when we drilled a hole in the wall and took a sample from the wall cavity, it's, the highest level was 250,000, but in most of our wall cavities, we were 50,000 plus through my entire house. That means we were breathing that stuff in every day. That means it was eroding our health slowly, insidiously, like a slow poison, because it's hard to put your finger on it. When you're in good shape. For me personally, I went from, I'm a CrossFitter. I try to stay in great shape. My diet is good. I practice what I preach. And I gained 25 pounds when I was in mold. And for the first time in my adult life, I was actually developing breast tissue, because of the estrogen metabolites of some of the molds that were growing in my house. And I couldn't figure out why. I was developing cherry angiomas on my skin because of the estrogen effect. I was breaking out in bouts of crying. Like I'm not a highly emotional person. Like I'm certainly not what you would consider to be a touchy-feely kind of fellow, but I would just bawl. I would just break out and cry for, random reasons. And again, when we got my blood work back and got everything back, part of it was estrogen. Some molds produce toxic compounds that mimic estrogen. So for me, I was losing all this muscle. I could do 50 push-ups easy with my eyes closed and one leg on the ground. And when I was in mold, it was like I was struggling for 15, and then I would injure my shoulder because that high level of estrogen dominance that was occurring was just eroding my muscle tissue. It was eroding my mental capacity. It was eroding my brain. God gave me a gift. I can say I appreciate that. My brain is very quick and very fast. And so most people, I didn't say most, but many people don't have that kind of a gift. And I think that's why I've had the success in my life as a doctor that I've had, because I can think deeply about really complex biochemistry. But that was slowing down. My brain, instead of working like a Ferrari, was working like a Pinto. And I just was getting super foggy. And it was very, very frustrating. And it was even more frustrating because my wife was in worse shape than I was, and my son's health was deteriorating. And again, my dog died. My other dog was getting sick. And we were all just trying to figure out why it was happening. And, once we got our mold results back, we got them back, and we left the house that day. So we'd already had a mold inspector come out a couple of times, and then we didn't like their answers because we felt like we were missing key pieces. And that's when we hired you guys, the Texas mold inspectors. And so originally, I think it was Heather that came out, and she said, this is beyond my ability. She knew it was a big problem. And so then it was like a week later, I think that Josh came out. And so we had our meeting with Josh, and he basically predicted what we should do, but we were in, I guess you could say, suspended disbelief, right? You're in shock. It's not easy to take on the information that you have to leave your house. And so, what I did as soon as that inspection was done, because there was mold, and we had found it very quickly behind the walls and in other places, was I put it in order for mycotoxin testing at that point. And then when we got that back, it was about a week later, the levels were so high, we walked out of the house and never went back in.
How long were you and Kate sick until y'all started to think mold?
It was kind of a unique situation because we have an ice maker in our house that had a separate water line to it. And the machine had broken down. And so we had somebody come out and fix it. And the water line was not properly connected. And so we started smelling must, and we figured that out. We figured out, it was the water line not properly connected. And so, there's a pony wall in our house where that ice maker was. And we tracked the wetness back to that. And so we pulled back the wall, and it was just covered in aspergillus. And so we'd had proper remediation done. And that was really where we first even had any idea of mold. Like, we weren't suspecting systemic mold through the whole house. Our primary suspicion was that we had this ice maker that had a leak. And so once we resolved that leak problem and we ripped out all that material and replaced it and remediated everything properly, we were no longer thinking mold. but when that happened, we could actually smell, we could smell a must coming from that area of the house. And that, once that was remediated properly, it was gone. But then we started to smell it was actually my wife could smell what smelled like a musty odor coming out of the wall. One of our rooms, we have a pocket door. So it's a door that slides in and out of the frame. It's, not on hinges, but it goes in. And so the airflow that was coming through that door, you could smell a little bit of musty odor there. So we thought there must be a problem somewhere else. And we'd had people come out. It was like 4 or 5 times we'd had them come out and look. Couldn't find. And again, this is over a period of many months. It's not like this happened in a week's time. We're trying to figure out where this musty smell is coming from. And it's not always there. Sometimes we can smell it and other times we can't. And so it's not consistent. So that makes it challenging. And then at the time, the mold inspectors that were coming out worked for the builder that built our house because we were under warranty. And so they were trying to figure it out. And of course, he was, it took me a little while to figure out that he was a complete idiot. But one of the things that happened was they would come out because they couldn't find anything because they weren't looking properly. And then they would come out and they would HEPA vacuum the walls and they would scrub the air, right? And one of the days that he came out, I wasn't home, but my wife was. He's got an air scrubber running and he turns it off and then he immediately sets up his air test and runs the air test. And she's like, doesn't that affect the sample? And he's like, oh no, it's not a big deal. And then she told me about that when I got home, and I was like, that's a huge deal. And so we got rid of that guy. I mean, we just like, you're not coming back in our house, because we knew at that point we were just dealing with somebody who was sophomoric in their ability to even help us. And maybe it was because the builder hired him on purpose because they knew that, or maybe it wasn't. I don't know. Our experience with our builder was actually really good. I didn't feel like they were trying to shortchange us. I really felt like they were sincere about trying to help us find the problem. I just don't think that guy was qualified to be in the room. I mean, as you know, it doesn't take much to become a mold inspector in the state of Texas. I think you can do it in like a weekend course or something, but that's not to say that people that have done the weekend course are bad people. It's just simply, it's a very complex topic and there's a lot to know and there's a lot to be said for experience. And I think at the end of the day, this guy just, as much as he claimed to have 20 years of experience, he wasn't good. He had 20 years of telling people the wrong thing as his experience. And that's not somebody we wanted working on our team. So when he scrubbed the air and then tried to do the mold test, that was when we really knew we had to get somebody in who knew what they were talking about. But we had, like I said, it was over a period of many months where they'd come in and they did visual inspections. I mean, they went through the attic, they went through, the outside, and they gave a good show of looking. And I even had the builder go up in my attic with me, and then we found problems. Like we found, one of the problems that we had was our HVAC system was improperly connected. So it wasn't properly dehumidifying our air. I mean, that was a big problem, part of the problem. Another was that when they installed the ductwork, they didn't put the proper insulators, so they had ducts touching each other. Those flex ducts that are in the attics, those big silver tubes. So they were like, would have one and another one was touching it. And so if you put your hand in between those ducts, you'd have moisture, wet. You'd pull your hand out and it was wet. And of course that was dripping into the insulation. I mean, it wasn't like massive running water or broken pipe, but I mean, it was just a source of moisture that it led us astray, because that wasn't actually why we had the mold problem. Ultimately, there were 3 big reasons why we had our mold problem. The first was the HVAC system was a nightmare. And I'd spent no spared expense on premium filtration and premium dehumidification. So like I bought the top of the line system that a person could buy, and the company that installed it so improperly that it never actually worked the way it was supposed to work. So there was that problem. And so our air wasn't being dehumidified appropriately. There was a problem in our foundation where there were errors in how they installed the moisture barrier for our foundation. And so like we had a room in the house where 80% humidity readings were on the floor. And so of course that's super high. And there was no running water. Again, it was just moisture emanating out of the foundation. And then we also had the brickwork around our windows and around our base of our house. The weep holes were non-functional. Many of them, they weren't even, the weep holes are those little water escape holes for water that, when it rains, that water comes down the back of the brick and escapes, and it doesn't go into your house because there's those weep holes at the bottom where it can escape. About 50% of our weep holes didn't go all the way through. They were just cosmetic, if you will, like it looked like a hole, but there was no hole. And then the other 50% had mortar damming. So when the bricklayers laid the brick, they tossed the excessive mortar behind the wall. So it fell and it blocked the weep holes from being able to drain. So every time it rained, when that moisture would come in, brick is not waterproof. So there was nowhere for it to go but into our home. That's why our wall cavities were so mold ridden. And then one of the other problems that we had was we didn't have enough ventilation in our attic. And so there wasn't enough, there was air intake, but not enough place for that air to go. And so what was happening to that moist air that was being brought in from the outside was being pushed into our wall cavity. And you combine the mold spores and the moist air with the inability for rainwater moisture to escape, and the foundation problem and the air conditioning problem. It's like a death by 1,000 cuts. And so there wasn't any one thing we could have remediated. And that was really for us, the devastating aspect of the information was, this isn't a fix. You can't just reconnect your HVAC. You can't fix the brick. It has to be torn down. There's so much mold in that house. It started to grow on the cabinets. Visibly, you could see it growing on the cabinets. And so it just was non-remediatable. So again, you build this house that you've been saving your whole life to accomplish, and now all of a sudden, not only do you have to leave it, because that was part of it, because I had to move my family out of that house into an extended stay hotel, which wasn't cheap, but it was the only way we were going to recover. And so you leave your house, but then you also learn that your house has to come down. So it's like almost like relief, but it's also like, denial. It's like the stages of grief, anger. You first go through anger, and then you kind of move your way through bargaining and denial and depression before you roll around to acceptance. And that part takes a little bit of time. I think everybody has their own journey through the psychology of losing their house when remediation is not possible. And which is, in our case, it wasn't possible.
How was that with your practice when you were going through it? Was that hard? Like whenever you were then talking to your patients that were going through mold, or did that just make you just even better in talking with them? Because now you understood where husbands come from, because a lot of times the husbands are the ones that need to really wrap their head around it, because usually the wife's sick.
Yeah, it made me definitely better. It made me worse at first. Before I knew it was mold, my brain was slower, so I wasn't as quick. I say it took me too long to figure it out, and it created a disservice to the people that were coming to see me, because my brain wasn't working as well. I make my living with my brain, right? Some people make their living with their physical labor, their abilities, and mine is to be able to think. And so it affected me first in that way. Once we got out, when we moved out of the house, it took about 2 months before I felt like my brain was back, fully back, where I could really think again without compromise. But it made me far better in multiple ways at helping people that were going through mold. And one, it made me understand more deeply what it was like to go through it. So empathetically, it just made me, wrong word, I don't even know how to phrase it, because I care already. It didn't make me more caring. I already care. I guess it made me more understanding, more empathetic about what a person was, what they had facing them, what was in front of them, if that makes sense. It also made me better in the sense that, I've had people where, before going through all this and trying to learn objectively how to better navigate it, because my past experience before going through mold was, my job was not to, the way I looked at it, my job was not to understand the mold inspection side, the construction side. It was, I kind of kept myself at a distance there because, one, I didn't have time to go learn it. Two, I wasn't the expert there. So I really couldn't comment, in any great way that would add to the conversation. But going through it and having to go through bad mold inspectors, knowing we had a problem, it made me understand the importance of trying to align the right experts and professionals, not just medically, but construction, attorneys, mold inspectors, engineers, architects. Like, there's so much, especially if a person's house is only a few years old and there's legal recourse. Like, there's so much that a person needs to know what to do to go through and navigate the legal aspect of holding a builder accountable, for construction flaw. It's a completely different game, though, on the other side, where if your house is 10 years old and there is no legal recourse, you still have to have the right team. Because one of the things that before mold that I would have commonly struggled with patients would be, we knew they were in mold because we would run definitive tests that would tell us that they were in mold. So, like, mycotoxins, extremely accurate. And I can detect mycotoxins in parts per billions in somebody's urine. Extremely effective and accurate way to know they're in mold. And if they're a housewife and they don't go anywhere else, it's not like they're going to work and there's the possibility of mold at work, right? So we can isolate that back to the house pretty easy. But then you'd get a mold inspector that might come out, again, do an air test or do something that wasn't, super, let's just say, comprehensive, and they wouldn't find it, or they wouldn't have the skill set to be able to recognize it, even though we knew it was a problem. And so what for me, what going through it and having to deal with all that has taught me was having the right person who can find it, who understands it, understands why it grows. Because more importantly, it's not so much, I look at it two ways. You want to know why the mold grew. That's the most important question to answer, not where the mold is. Where the mold is important. But a lot of people see where the mold is and then they clean that, but then it comes back because they don't know why it grew. And I think that's where really a good team can help you understand how to do a remediation that won't fail. Because so many people would do remediation and it would fail, and we would be trying to get mycotoxins out of them through binding agents and other things, and we'd come back and we would be unsuccessful, mainly because what they thought was a successful remediation was not. So for me to go through it made me realize that you really have to have almost like a functional medicine investigation forensically of mold in the house. The same way a person needs a functional investigation in their health, they need that same thing for their house, so that we can find out where it's growing, and then we can find out why it's growing. And then once we know the answer to those two questions, only then at that point can a good remediation plan be created where a person can feel confident that when they're spending thousands and thousands of dollars to get the stuff cleaned up, that they're not going to spend that money in vain, only to not have had a successful remediation. So for me, going through it made me more diligent about helping those individuals navigate that side of it. Because in the past, I'd always just trust the experts in that were in that arena. But what I realized was I had to become an expert to get through my own situation, because of the people that were working on my team initially were not. I just had to come to find out they really weren't experts. They really didn't know what they were talking about. They weren't qualified. And, I wasn't going to allow my family's health to just continue to deteriorate. So I had to figure it out. And so we spent a lot of time trying to objectify the process of navigating mold, from the perspective of being objective about whether or not we even suspect a person is being poisoned by mold, which comes into being able to do the right types of tests to understand whether that's happening, which I do in my practice. But then there's the other side, which is having, a really good forensic mold investigator who understands, how to find it and why it grows in the first place, and has an understanding of HVAC and construction to the extent that they understand that part of their job is a visual inspection to find those types of flaws and then let those findings lead them in the right direction. All the way down to, you know, the remediation process, what needs to be remediated, what cannot be saved, and what, you know, what should you not try to remediate, like a mattress, for example, you know, or an area rug or carpet or thick curtains or comforters, things that, you know, harbor mycotoxins that there's no possible way you're really going to get them all out of there. So, you know, it's helping people navigate what needs to be remediated versus what can't be remediated or shouldn't be attempted to remediate, because there's all kinds. You can get online and there's all kinds of opinions on that. And, you know, when you're talking about somebody losing the contents of their house, this is no small matter. I mean, one, most people's homes are their number one investment. You know, I mean, you know, you're going to most people spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on their home. And if their home has to come down to the studs, they've lost that money. Like it's gone, poof, right? And then whatever money it costs to repair it, if it's even repairable. But they haven't just lost their home. They've also lost, in many cases, a lifetime of accumulation of things in their life that have meaning to them. And I know some people will say, well, physical things aren't important. Health is important. Yeah, okay. Go through mold and tell me that physical things aren't important, and that spending hundreds of thousands of dollars over the course of your life and losing all of those things plus the value of your home is not somehow devastating. Yes, it's very helpful to get your health back. Yes, you should be thankful to find the mold and to be able to get out of it and to be able to regain your health. But, you know, in reality, you're going to be upset about losing everything. I mean, and it's not even just, I mean, physical things can be replaced, but some things are not replaceable. Like you can't replace, you know, the Christmas ornament that your son made for you. You know, I mean, you know, I lost a son years ago, and you know, you can't replace the things that he made. You know, I can't replace the flag. He had a military burial.
I know one of the items that was very close to you for your son was his guitars.
Yeah, I mean, he one of the guitars that he had, I said we lost a son, and he had a military burial. His flag. He also had a guitar that he left my other son. You don't get those things back. And they are things, but they do have meaning. And it does hurt. You know, it leaves a scar. And, you know, that's hard to go through when your health is also in the tank. You know, going through that when you don't feel well, losing things. And it, you know, I said a death by 1,000 cuts because you don't even realize all the things that you lost until you try to get settled into a new place. And you go to grab something, you know, or you go to reach for something that you had, and it's gone. And it's just another daily reminder. It's tough. You know, it's tough to go through that. And if you've never been through it, it's really hard to understand. And I think that's why I'm better today, is because I went through it. And so I can understand the situation that people go through better than just simply trying to be a guy who helps them, you know, navigate restoring their health from mold. I can also help them navigate, you know, how to get back on their feet to a certain extent. I can help them navigate the loss. You know, I'm a pastor as well. I mean, part of my background is pastoral training. And so I counsel people. And so I can help them navigate that better than I ever could as a result of going through it. And, I think that's part of it. I think any great doctor is greater when they've gone through the very thing they're trying to help people with, because they have an understanding of it on such a deep, intimate, visceral level that you couldn't understand if you hadn't gone through it. And so for me, it was that's how it made me better, I think, aside from the fact that, I'm now more equipped at putting the right tools in their hands to be the most objective as possible that they can be about how they're going to proceed by making decisions. Do you throw this away? Do you not throw this away? Do you get to keep that? Do you know what I mean? Like, those are the things that there are too many opinions on. And I think I can be a lot more objective when I'm helping people try to navigate the aftermath. Once they get out of the house, now there's a rebuilding of of a new home, and there's a rebuilding and a recollection of the things lost that in some cases, like I said, some things have meaning that can't be replaced. Other things, plates and dishes, can be replaced. Heirlooms can't be replaced, though. Special heirlooms and things that those things you lose, and those are things that can be tough to lose. But it's just made me better at helping people cope with the depression, the anger, and in even some cases the denial, because a lot of people will say, no, I don't have to get rid of that, or I don't have to get rid of that, and and then I'll have a follow-up with them, and they're like, you were right, I should have got rid of it, it made me sick. And it's not that I don't want to be the guy saying I told you so. It's just that it helps me understand it. Yeah, I get it. You wanted to keep that thing. I understand it. You wanted to keep the thing because it had value to you. And certainly I don't blame you for making the attempt, but I'm glad you determined that it was making you sick and you can let it go now. It just makes that whole conversation after the fact, because most people don't realize that mold is not a, hey, we have some mold, let's get it remediated and we'll be better next week. This is a process that can take years of your life, and in my case, years of my life were taken as a result of it. I mean, years of my life and the way I'd set up my life were, I won't say robbed from me, but they were taken. And they were taken for a reason. And I just feel like there has to be a reason in it. And I'm a spiritual guy. And I believe that God put me through that for a reason. And he didn't make me go through that just to punish me for some esoteric, unknown, strange thing. I think he put me through it mainly because if I really think about it, I was my personal growth in practice, in clinical practice, was largely dependent upon years of research and hard work and dedication and doing what others weren't willing to do. I went to school for 9 years. I went postgraduate for an extra 2 years. I read 20 hours a week, and I spend that time away from my family to make sure that I stay abreast of research and literature to make me a better person. And there was a time around that time where I was saying, please quit sending me mold. There was a time where I got complacent in my diligence. And I think we all go through that in life, where we hit a point where we just kind of back off and we find ourselves comfortable in where we're at, but not pursuing more growth the way we should. And I was in that spot when mold hit my family, definitely. And it made me wake up as well. I mean, there was one added benefit, if I really think about it, is it made me realize that I can never get complacent and not push to become bigger, better, stronger, smarter. I can never allow myself to become stagnant. And I think it just said, I think it was the other message, right? Part of the message was you need to be better at mold, because mold is a major epidemic in the United States and in industrialized countries. And it's going to be one of the biggest problems in healthcare, probably already is, but in the next 20 years, we're going to see the ramifications of mold take its toll on our communities because of the cheap construction, the unskilled labor, the homes being slapped up without care. And without the proper diligence. And so we're seeing that impact already come to fruition. And I think God was just trying to prepare me in a couple ways. One was to get smart about it so that I could help people navigate it and make this more aware in the world, to make people as aware of mold as they are of gluten. I mean, I look back at my career and I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that there are about a half dozen of us doctors that 20 years ago, when gluten was not a thing anyone ever really heard of, and today everybody in the country has heard of it. And I'm one of the reasons why that has happened. I'm certain of that because of our outreach and our hard work and our foundation. And I think God wanted me to do that for mold. I think he wanted me to go through it, and I think he wanted me to not get complacent.
I honestly I'm a spiritual person too. And I don't know if I told you this, but I remember when we got out of mold, and I saw an interview of you talking about mold. It had to do with a teacher being sick at a school. And I was like, thank God there's actually a doctor talking about this. I don't feel as crazy anymore, because before we ever went through mold, somebody said mold, I thought they were crazy. And then I went through it and I found out that no, mold is truly dangerous. And then whenever we met and then I heard your name, it sounded similar, or familiar to me. And I was like, oh my gosh, he's going through mold. I remembered him. I remembered you on that interview. And I don't like bad things to happen to anybody, but I do believe that some things happen to some people for a greater reason. And I do feel that you were chosen to do what you're doing. I mean, do you mind talking about kind of the project you're putting together to help educate people?
Not at all. Yeah, what I'm trying to do is organize all the thought leaders in mold, from the microbiologists and the PhDs and the medical docs that treat people, to engineers and architects, to mold inspectors, to the construction aspect of it. We're just trying to pull together the resources to say, hey, if you're building a house, you need to be aware of all these things. If you're not building a house and you suspect mold, you need to be aware of these things. You need to be aware that these things exist to help you understand whether or not there's a possibility that mold could be causing your illness. If you have a chronic illness and you don't know why, part of this is we want you to understand the scope of how mold can affect you physiologically. What are the symptoms? What are the common manifestations? What are the things to look for first? Like, what is it? It's going to bring a greater recognition of mold-induced illness, because mold affects people in three ways. And most people aren't aware of this, the vast majority of the medical community will tell you if you're not allergic to mold, it's not a problem. And those guys, in my opinion, they're dangerous with that attitude. Even if you look at the federal websites on mycotoxins, and you'll see all the different disease linkages and associations. It's not like something we don't know about, but the doctors who are, that supposed to be the experts in immunology, like the immunologists, they all say mold mycotoxicosis doesn't exist. Like they're just their heads in the sand, and they don't even read the literature. Like it's just like, I say it and therefore it's true. And anyway, we're trying to help people navigate around that, just like with gluten, right? 20 years ago, gluten causes 140 different medical conditions. And, that being the case, it doesn't mean it's the cause of all of those conditions or the only cause of those conditions. But if you have a gluten sensitivity and you don't know about it, and you have that condition and don't know why, and there's no hope and the medicine's not working, it's not a stretch to change your diet to recapture your life. You know what I mean? And we want to make that same recognition, with mold and mold illness. And we want to dispel a lot of the myths, because you can have a mold allergy, and it's common, but most people are not having mold allergy symptoms. Most people are having mycotoxicosis, which is mold produces a poison. There's thousands of these types of mycotoxins that mold produces. And its job is to destroy other life forms around it so that it can grow and propagate better, right? Mold is God's great equalizer. It, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Mold, it returns things back to the earth. That's what its job is. If we really think about, on a biological level, that's why we see mold on decaying matter and decaying debris. The reason it's decaying is because the toxins that mold is releasing onto it are eroding it, are destroying it, are breaking it down into the final common denominator nutrients that can go back to the soil and be recycled. If you're living in that, your body's being recycled. And that's not an allergy. That's a very different thing. You're being poisoned. Mold toxins work like radiation, slow dose, low dose radiation. And that's really the biggest risk for most people. And then once you're in it long enough, you become immunocompromised because it shuts down aspects of the immune system. And then what ends up happening is then mold starts growing on the person or in the person. So, most people have heard of a yeast overgrowth, which is one type of mold, but that's not really even what I'm talking about. Candida, which is the predominant species that causes yeast overgrowth in humans, is generally not a mold that you see growing on the walls. What I'm talking about is aspergillus starts to grow in your lungs, and it's just got a 60% mortality rate. Once it hits your lungs, the odds are you're not going to make it. That's what happens when you're in mold long enough, where it compromises your immune system's ability to defend you from the mold in your environment, so that it slowly continues to erode you by growing on you and eroding you faster. And that's not a very well recognized phenomena, of mold. But I lose very few patients in my practice. But I lost a gentleman one time. He was in mold. He knew he was in mold. We found his mold. We knew it. I was adamant that he needed to get out, and he refused to leave the home, and he died about a year later from aspergillosis of the lungs. It invaded his lungs and killed him. And it was after that his wife, who was also in it, she actually got the message. It took her husband to die before she understood that she needed to get the hell out of the house. My goal is that never happens to anyone again. There was no reason why he should have been in that house, other than his other medical doctors, were dismissing. I mean, that's the other thing. You're playing tug of war. As a chiropractor, I'm not a fool. I know that the world does not view my profession as on a pedestal of expertise the way they might view somebody who has a medical degree, a medical doctor degree. And I understand that, and I know that. And so when I'm having a conversation about mold illness with somebody, and then their medical doctor is having that same conversation, but then downplaying it as, no, it's not, that's not it. That's a struggle, right? And so part of my goal is, let's elevate this conversation. That was a chiropractor that elevated the conversation of gluten, and now today, look how well known and how well researched and documented it is, because of the efforts that myself and several of my colleagues put in, which is interesting because most of us were chiropractors. When you really look at it.
You also saved a girl's life because you figured out it was gluten, did you not?
Lots of them, but yeah, I mean, we had one of my first patients in private practice was a little girl with terminal juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. They gave her 6 months to live. They diagnosed her at the age of 2, and they've been medicating her with an anti-cancer drug called methotrexate, which is a very toxic drug. And they put a permanent port in her arm because she frequented the hospital so often for pain medication, because they were not controlling her disease. Her disease was totally uncontrolled, even with medicine. And so after 7 years of poisoning this girl with toxic medicines, the rheumatologist looked at her mom and said, you got to go home, and you got to prepare for her death. She's got 6 months. And so to me, what that represented was an utter failure, where it's one thing to say, look, we don't know what's causing the illness, seek out additional expertise. It's another thing to say, we don't know what's causing the illness, but don't you dare seek out additional expertise. And don't you dare question me. What we're doing is the right thing to do. Like that, to me, that's hubris. And it's a sin, because look, I don't know everything. There'll be people that come to me and they'll stump me. I'm not going to say, don't see anyone else because only I could figure it out, because my ego's not that big. But we have an ego problem. in our medical societies. We do. And we have a, oh gosh, we could really go deep here. What we have is we have a problem whereby we refuse to recognize the importance of diet and lifestyle as a foundational component to health. Whether you're in mold or whether you're gluten sensitive or whether you have autoimmune disease, it doesn't matter. Like, you're never going to achieve good health with an unhealthy diet and unhealthy behaviors, no matter what drug you take. Drug deficiencies are not what cause illness. You know, if we look at fundamentally, there are categorical causes of illness. There's 4 primary triggers of illness in humans today. Number 1, it's their diet. Number 2, it's chemical exposures from the environment and from their diet. Number 3, it's microbial imbalance, not infection, but we have so many different chemicals that affect our microbiomes that we're being exposed to on a daily basis. It creates a huge imbalance in the shift of the bacteria and other microorganisms that are friendly, that live inside of us, that help us digest our food and make vitamins and navigate the world. And then the 4th is nutritional deficit. I mean, those 4 triggers, categorically, if doctors would just, as a standard of practice, measure those things in absolutely everyone who walked in the door, my practice would close down. I wouldn't be here, because the reason people come to me is because they're failed time and time again by a system that says the drug will fix your problem and don't question beyond the drug. And when it doesn't fix their problem, like in Ginger's case, you know, she was terminal. You know, this was a little girl who was gluten sensitive and was allergic to blueberries. And when we figured that out, in 6 months, her permanent port came out. In 12 months, she was in total remission. And she's in her 20s. She's gone on, graduated, you know, college, and she's doing good things in the world because we changed her diet. That was my precursor into the power of diet change, and really the power of just using the power of understanding about how you could change a person's diet and save their life. But we just don't have that appreciation. There's such a lack of respect for that. You know, in medical school, there's 7 hours at most of nutritional education. Most people don't even know that. They think, oh, you went to medical school, you're an expert. And our society would have us believe that. But look, I've been involved in academia as well. I'm not just a practicing clinician. I've been paid by some of the top companies in the world to teach medical doctors. We used to run a program, and, you know, GI doctors from all over the world would fly in, and they would come through my training as a chiropractor, right? Which is, you think about it, it's kind of ironic that they would pay a chiropractor to get trained to learn something. But that's the reality. Many of them aren't open to learning. And so they continue with the status quo of dismissing diet and lifestyle as being important. And we see, you know, again, we see the same thing with mold illness, and that they don't believe it exists or don't know what to even say about it. So they don't say anything about it. And instead of saying, yeah, it could play a role, that's a possibility, let me refer you to somebody who might be able to talk to you more about that and understand that better, they just dismiss it the same way they dismiss nutrition. Not all of them, but the vast majority, in my experience, do.
I think that what you're doing in the project that you're putting together is so important, because today I don't really see kids outside. They're like inside playing games, you know. They're not really outside getting a break from the indoor environment. And so the indoor environment, you know, like they say, 90% of your time is now spent indoors, you know, is so critical. So I love that you're bringing awareness to the importance of your indoor environment and mold, like you did with gluten, in order to help save more people. So thank you for that.
Yeah, you're welcome. Well, thank you for what you guys are doing. I think your group is amazing, and you're doing wonderful things to save lives. And I'm always behind anybody who's on my team in that way. I mean, my mission in life is to save 100 million. And I'm not gonna ever get complacent again until we reach that goal.
If people want to come and find you, where can you tell them where they can find you, your website? You're located in Sugar Land, Texas, your practice is, right?
It is. Yeah, they can go to drpeterosborne.com and learn more about me there. And that's Dr. Peter Osborne. gluten.com. And then if they want to learn more about gluten, they can come to glutenfreesociety.org. That's our gluten base, our gluten foundation. So we do live Q&As every week on YouTube and Facebook. So if anybody's watching this and they just want to kind of get their toes wet, learn a little bit more about me and maybe ask a few questions and see if mold or gluten may be a related issue in their chronic autoimmune problem, that's a good place to kind of just get to know me.
Dr. Osborne, thank you again for coming on to this podcast and sharing your story and also some of the knowledge that you just shared with us too. We really appreciate it. And it, like Elizabeth said, it's an honor. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.